100 kilometers from Lagos, there is a piece of coastline that has become a graveyard for billion-dollar ambitions. This is the coast of Nigeria, the most populous country in Africa and one of its largest economies. And right here, just east of Lagos, between the city and the oil fields of Niger Delta, lies a stretch of coastline that has remained largely underdeveloped for 21 years. But back in 2004, two Nigerian state governments marked out this exact spot on the map, an area covering 10,000 hectares. To put that into perspective, that's about 7 times the size of Tanger Med, the Moroccan port that today handles more container traffic than any other port in Africa. On paper, this was supposed to become one of the largest industrial zones in West Africa. The plans mapped out a deep water port, a massive gas processing plant, a refinery, and a network of supporting industry. The entire industrial future of West Africa was quite literally mapped on this stretch of coastline. So in 2007, the Nigerian National Oil Company brings in 3 of the biggest energy companies in the world, Shell, Chevron, and BG Group, out of the UK. A project value at roughly $10 to $14 billion. BG walks out in 2009, Shell and Chevron walks out in 2013. And just like that, the whole project dies. The map goes blank again. Meanwhile, 100 kilometers west over here in Lagos, Nigeria's main port is collapsing under itself. Ships waiting 2 weeks to dock, truck queue stretching back 10 kilometers from the gate. The World Bank says this single bottleneck is costing Nigeria $19 billion a year. Look at this. The entire trade of a country of 220 million people is running through one congested corridor in one city. And then in June 2025, something changed. A new set of construction permits was filed for this same spot on the map. The applicant was Aliko Dangote, the richest person in Africa. And what he planned to build on the very ground that Shell and Chevron had once walked away from was extraordinary. A deep water port that could become one of the deepest ports in Africa. And the more I studied this map, the more I realized something. The real story isn't that Dangote is building it. His real story is why nobody else could. Nigeria has 6 designated seaports. On paper, the country is a maritime power. In practice, almost the entire trade lifeline of West Africa's largest economy runs through 2 terminals in Lagos, the Lagos Port Complex at Apapa and Tinkan Island next to it. Together, they handle roughly 70% of Nigerian cargo. Both sit inside a dense urban district. Both are connected to the rest of the country by roads that were not designed for what they now carry. The African Center for Supply Chain estimates Nigeria loses about 14.2 billion every year to bottlenecks at Apapa and Tinkan. A Dutch maritime consultancy, Dynama, puts Nigeria daily losses from delay at $55 million. Trucks wait 10 to 15 days to enter the gates. Some shippers have paid more in local transport from port to warehouse than they paid for the entire ocean voyage from Europe. The numbers have a consequence. In 2018, the port of Lome in Togo, a country whose entire population is smaller than the city of Lagos, overtook Apapa to become the busiest container port in West Africa. Nigerian importers now route cargo through Cotonou, Lome, and Tema in Ghana, then truck it back across borders. The country was outsourcing its own coastline. In April 2023, a partial answer arrived. The Lekki Deep Sea Port, a $1.5 billion facility built by China Harbour Engineering Company and the Singapore-based Tolaram Group, with a 16.5-meter draught and capacity for vessels up to 18,000 TEU. Opened 90 kilometers east of Lagos, it is now Nigeria's deepest and largest seaport. By the end of 2025, Lekki had become Nigeria's busiest port by cargo volume, handling over 40% of the country's total throughput, and had pushed Tinkan Island into 3rd place by trade value. But Lekki has a ceiling. Its container yard sits on just 90 hectares. Its design tops out at 2.7 million TEU a year and it serves the whole Nigerian economy, not a single shipper. For the largest private industrial operator on the continent, that wasn't going to be enough. To understand why Aliko Dangote needs his own port, you have to understand what he has spent the last decade building 30 kilometers east of Lagos. Dangote Petroleum Refinery, commissioned in 2023 inside Lekki Free Trade Zone, is the largest single-train refinery on earth. In February 2026, it reached its full nameplate capacity of 650,000 barrels of crude oil per day. Within weeks, it was shipping refining product to Tanzania, Ghana, Cameroon, and beyond. For the first time in decades, Nigeria was exporting refined fuel at a scale large enough to begin reversing its dependence on imports. Next to it is a fertilizer plant that can produce 3 million tons a year, making it one of the largest in the world. Beside that is a polypropylene plant, and beside that are Dangote's own port facilities, but there's only limited space for ships, and only ships up to certain size can use them. In October 2025, Dangote announced the next move, doubling refinery to 1.4 million barrels per day within 3 years, tripling fertilizer output to roughly 12 million tons, and stretching toward what the group calls Vision 2030, a target of $100 billion in annual enterprise value. The match broke first in 2025 when conflict in the Middle East disrupted shipments through the Strait of Hormuz. The Dangote refinery began running flat out, supplying gasoline and diesel to neighboring African states whose imports had stopped arriving. Dangote himself said the refinery was running at full capacity. What was missing was a large enough port facility to handle the shipments. The group also began talking publicly about exporting liquefied natural gas. Edwin, Dangote's vice president, told reporters that a planned pipeline from Niger Delta to Lagos would eventually feed an LNG operation larger than Nigeria LNG Limited. The joint venture between State Oil Company and Shell, Total Energies, and Eni that has dominated Nigerian gas exports since 1999. You cannot do any of that through Lekki Jetty. You cannot do it through Apapa. You need a new port, a bigger port, a port you can control. And there was exactly one site on Nigerian coast that had already been zoned, surveyed, and abandoned, waiting. The Olokola Free Trade Zone was meant to be Nigeria's industrial moonshot. In 2004, the government of Ogun and Ondo State co-founded it across 10,500 hectares of Atlantic coastline. Straddling the Ogun waterside, Ilaje local government areas. In March 2007, under President Olusegun Obasanjo, the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, Shell, Chevron, and BG Group signed a memorandum of understanding to anchor the zone with Olokola LNG, known as OK LNG. The plant produced 12.5 million tons of liquefied natural gas a year and 15,000 barrels of condensate a day. A 14 billion investment projected to employ 28,000 people. It never happened. Political turnover in Ogun State broke the partnership. BG Group exited in 2009. Shell and Chevron walked away in August 2013. NNPC was left holding the project alone and it stalled. Around the same time, Aliko Dangote himself was at Olokola planning an 8 billion oil refinery on the site. The project also collapsed when the state government under Governor Ibikunle Amosun pushed back on the terms. Dangote moved the refinery 100 kilometers west to Lekki in Lagos State. The Ogun governor at the time, Dapo Obiodun, would later describe the groundbreaking in Lagos as a day of heartbreak for Ogun. In March 2025, Dangote came back. At a meeting in Abeokuta with Ogun State Executive Council, he announced his return to Olokola, explicitly crediting Governor Abiodun's investor-friendly policies. By late June 2025, he had filed the paperwork to begin construction. In May 2026, his group held a community engagement on the site. The managing director leading it, Captain Jamil Mohamed Abubakar, a former commercial pilot and as of April 2026, the newly appointed head of infrastructure and logistics at Dangote Group. Abubakar told local communities that the port will support everything: fertilizer export, petrochemical products, refined fuel, future LNG export, and the import of heavy equipment needed to expand the Dangote refinery. The long-abandoned project had found a new owner. So what is Dangote actually building? The published footprint of Olokola deep sea port is more than 10,000 hectares, a maritime and industrial complex spanning 2 states along the Gulf of Guinea. To put that into perspective, Tanger Med in Morocco, Africa's busiest container port, covers about 1,400 hectares. Lekki Port, Nigeria's biggest modern port, covers about 90 hectares. Olokola is planned to cover more than 10,000 hectares, making it over 7 times larger than Tanger Med by land area. Dangote's public statement described it as the biggest, deepest port in Nigeria and the largest deep water port in Africa upon completion. An integrated export hub designed primarily for his own industrial output with the scale to accept the largest container vessels afloat. The infrastructure plan extends well beyond waterline. Dangote Industries is advancing a gas pipeline from Niger Delta to feed a future LNG export terminal on the site. Dangote Vice President Edwin has said publicly the company intends to exceed the output of Nigeria LNG Limited, which export around 17 million tons in recent years. If Dangote achieved that, a single private group will overtake a joint venture between Nigerian state and 3 of the largest oil majors in the world. The port will also have one immediate unusual feature: a captive shipper. The Dangote refinery, the fertilizer plant, the petrochemicals, all of it is designed to flow through Olokola. Most ports complete for cargo. This one starts with its anchor tenant already operating at full capacity, 100 kilometers away, generating products with nowhere big enough to live from. That is what makes the economies works where they didn't work for Shell, Chevron, and BG. And it also makes the geopolitics complicated. For 2 decades, the center of gravity for West African shipping has been drifting away from Nigeria. Lomé in Togo, Tema in Ghana, Abidjan in Cote d'Ivoire. These smaller economies built or modernized their port while Apapa stagnate. The result was that the largest market in Africa imported a significant share of its own consumer goods via foreign ports, then trucked them across land borders. Between 2013 and nearly 2020s, the Togolese economy effectively captured logistic revenue that belonged to Lagos. Lekki Port began to reverse that. Olokola, if built at the scale Dangote is describing, accelerates the shift dramatically. In May 2026, Dangote went further, addressing the Port Management Association of West Africa and Central Africa in Lagos. He said the group was treating deep sea port development as a core investment priority, not only in Nigeria, but across the continent. He confirmed talks with the president of Tanzania about additional port projects on the East African coast. Maritime logistics, he argued, had become limiting factor for African industrial growth. Vessels waiting 2 weeks or more to discharge in some West African ports. The implications are huge. A private Nigerian company is positioning itself to operate ports on both sides of Africa, one on the Atlantic coast and another on the Indian Ocean as part of a single logistics network. The idea is similar to what Morocco achieved with Tanger Med, The key difference is that Tanger Med was built and led by the government, while the Dangote's project is driven by a private company. Apapa was a single point of failure for the entire economy. Lekki added redundancy. Olokola will add a second deep water gateway 100 kilometers further east with industrial capacity around it from day one. The risk concentration that allowed 10-kilometer truck queue to cost the country $14 billion a year begins slowly to break. For Ogun and Ondo State, the project resurrects 2 decades of frozen ambition. For Nigerian shippers, it threatens at least to expose Apapa's inefficiencies to genuine competition. For the wider region, it raises a question that hasn't seriously been asked since the colonial port grid was drawn. Where actually should Africa's trade gateway sit? There are things this port still has to prove. The OK LNG site has been declared back before. Governor Mosun said so in 2015. Governor Abiodun said so in 2019. Dangote said so in 2013, then left. The history of Nigerian infrastructure is full of moments where paperwork was filed and the cranes never came. The scale Dangote is now committing to: a 10,000 hectare integrated industrial port, a gas pipeline for Niger Delta to coast, and an LNG operation his own vice president says will surpass Nigerian LNG, will be ambitious for a sovereign government. It is being attempted by a single industrial group controlled by a man Bloomberg ranks as Africa's richest, with holdings worth roughly $33 billion. But 3 things are different this time. First, the anchor demand exists. The refinery is running at full capacity, the fertilizer plant is exporting, the product is already there, waiting for a bigger dock or jetty. Second, the leadership structure has been formalized. Captain Jamil Abubakar's appointment in April 2026 created a dedicated managing director for Dangote Port, separate from oil and fertilizer. And third, the political alignment in Ogun State has held for a full electoral cycle longer than the cycles that kill OK LNG. If it works, it doesn't just give Nigeria a second deep water port, it puts the continent's biggest industrial conglomerate in operational control of one of the largest maritime gateways on the Atlantic coast, and quietly rewrite who decides what leaves Africa and how. For the first time since 2004, the men who control the cargo are also the same men building the port. If you love African infrastructure projects like this, please like and subscribe, and see you on the next one.